1,000 years. That is the length of time historians describe as the Dark Ages, from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the year 476 to the dawning of the Renaissance in Europe. But if you turn back the pages of history, the first sensation is not one of darkness, but of emptiness. A void so chilling that entire movements of society, culture, war, and science seem to have vanished from the record. We are told this was a time drowned in chaos, ignorance, and superstition, that nothing was created, no meaningful progress was made. But have you ever asked yourself how that could possibly be true for nearly a millennium on the same continent that gave birth to minds like Aristotle, Archimedes, and Cicero? And more importantly, who was it that branded this time as the Dark Ages? The answer is none other than the Church, or more precisely, those who seized control of knowledge, books, and the memory of a fallen civilization. When Rome collapsed and the secular order crumbled, the Christian Church, still in its early form, rose like a solitary beacon. But was its light meant to guide or merely to blind? Entire libraries, schools, and research centers of the ancient world were destroyed, purged in the name of faith. Thousands of manuscripts in Greek, secular Latin, and Coptic quietly disappeared from the map of human knowledge. Only those texts copied into doctrinal Latin, a language accessible only to specially trained monks, were permitted to survive. And these surviving works were locked away in monasteries, churches, and ultimately the Vatican's secret archives. No secular authority remained strong enough to challenge this. No independent scholarly system existed to verify truth. For centuries, what Europeans knew of their past was only what the Church allowed them to know. So was the Dark Ages truly a period of decline? Or was it a manufactured fog concealing something deeper, something darker? Perhaps history was never lost, only sealed. If that is so, the question is no longer what happened, but who does not want you to know that it happened at all? The year was 476, it is remembered. Meanwhile, in China, under the Sui and Tang dynasties, a golden age unfolded. Block printing was invented, musical instruments advanced, poetry reached new heights with masters like Li Bai and Du Fu. In the Arab world, science and learning thrived. Al-Khwarizmi laid the foundations of algebra. The first hospitals opened to the public. The Library of Baghdad contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. And Europe? Europe appeared untouched by astronomy, mathematics, or the compass. While the East burned with light, the West was drained of memory. Who benefited from this silence? The answer lies not beyond Europe, but within it. It had always been there, quiet, constant, growing stronger. The Church. When people were taught they lived in darkness, when they believed their ancestors had been lost to ignorance, they did not question. They did not doubt what the pulpit told them. They did not seek books because books no longer existed. They did not explore because knowledge itself had become heresy. The Vatican did not need to enforce compliance with swords or flames. It only needed to master silence. They only needed to declare one definition. Darkness and fear did the rest. In a world without war, without open debate, without invention, one might think nothing at all had taken place. But sometimes silence, long and unbroken, is the clearest trace of a hidden crime, the erasure of an entire chapter of human history. History is not just the record of what occurred. It is what has been told and retold and permitted to survive. And when the only storytellers are men cloaked in robes of faith, their account is never neutral truth, but a chosen version, carefully shaped to serve their purpose. After Rome fell, nearly every secular scholarly institution in Europe collapsed. Public libraries were deserted. Secular schools shut their doors. Scholars, if they escaped death, either retreated into isolation or submitted to the church just to continue their work. In that climate, the only places where manuscripts still lived were monasteries behind stone walls where knowledge filtered through narrow slits of supervision. But here lies a crucial detail often overlooked. Ancient Roman and Greek texts were not simply copied. They were rewritten in ecclesiastical Latin, a language narrowed by theology, more rigid in meaning and accessible only to the clerical elite trained to read it. Where classical Latin once carried the wisdom of law, literature, and science, Church Latin became the lock on a treasure chest few could open. The effects were devastating. The mathematics of Pythagoras, the political thought of Cicero, the natural philosophy of Aristotle, if judged contrary to doctrine, were altered, reinterpreted, or simply abandoned. Thousands of works branded heretical, pagan, or unnecessary to salvation were burned, hidden, or allowed to vanish forever in vaults no layman would ever see. A new era dawned, an era where knowledge no longer freed humanity, but bound it. If someone wished to know history, they went to a priest. If they sought ancient writings, they needed permission and guidance to interpret them in the right way. Independent verification disappeared. Debate was forbidden. History itself became doctrine, and doctrine could never be challenged. It is often said history is written by the victors, but here the victors did not need to rewrite everything. They only needed to preserve what suited them and let the rest dissolve into oblivion. Thus, behind the silent walls of monasteries, a new history was crafted, not with fire and sword, but with ink and silence. And silence raises its own questions. There are gaps in time so profound they make us wonder if those centuries even existed. A theory known as the phantom time hypothesis sent tremors through scholarship in the late 20th century. It claimed roughly 300 years, from about 614 to 911, never actually happened. In other words, our very timeline may have been stretched, an artificial age slipped into the calendar. At first the idea sounds absurd, yet when the sparse records of Europe are examined, the unease begins. Why are so few events reliably recorded in that span? Why do texts from different regions contradict each other on dates for the same supposed events? Why do kings, battles, even dynasties echo earlier history as if copied under new names? Consider Charlemagne, said to reign in the early 9th century. His campaigns, reforms, and governance resemble with eerie closeness those of Constantine the Great of the 4th century, almost as if history were reprinted under a different title. And who would have the power and the motive to bend time itself? Scholars point to three figures: Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor, Gerbert of Aurillac, a monk, and historian who later became Pope Sylvester II, and of course, the Vatican. By adding years, a ruler could appear to ascend precisely at a divinely chosen moment. An empire could legitimize its reign simply by adjusting the calendar. If the Church wished to prove prophecy fulfilled, then controlling the timeline itself was the perfect tool. Strangely, the Vatican has never officially denied this theory, nor have they confirmed it. Silence, once again, serves them best. A force that commands both knowledge and time does not need to argue. It need only endure until all doubt fades. And so it is possible that we live inside a history edited like Scripture, crafted by those who understood how to wield time itself, not with weapons, but with the calendar. Perhaps our world is not only fragmented, but staged, a theatre where the past is curated, the future is guided, and the present is a haze where real and fabricated memories intertwine. When modern researchers began comparing ancient eclipse records with the dates preserved in European history during the so-called Dark Ages, they found unsettling contradictions. Eclipses documented in Greek, Jewish, and Chinese texts often had no corresponding event in Western accounts. At the same time, certain European events that were said to have occurred during an eclipse were described under clear skies. These were not small errors of days, but gaps stretching across decades, even centuries. What does it mean when the truth written in the heavens no longer matches the version of history recorded on Earth? In medieval Europe, astronomers were not free to investigate these inconsistencies. Instead, they were pressured to bend their calculations to match the Church's approved timeline. If a celestial event did not align with accepted history, it was dismissed as false, heretical, or even a deception of the devil. We often forget the immense influence the Vatican once held over astronomy itself. Though the Vatican Observatory, known as the Specula Vaticana, was formally founded in the 16th century, the clergy had long been tracking celestial movements in secret. These records, kept from public eyes, formed a private archive of time, space, and shifting history. To control astronomy was to control the ability to rewrite the calendar of civilization, and so the truth of the sky was bent to serve the Church's vision of history. The stars did not lie, but men altered their message. Today, algorithms allow us to trace astronomical events back with precision measured in minutes. These calculations make the gaps in European history increasingly difficult to explain. Events once declared sacred, marked by the heavens with an eclipse, show no trace in the actual sky. And yet the Vatican remained silent through the Middle Ages. Those who dared to look up and speak truths that contradicted the Church, its earthly authority, were silenced. Giordano Bruno was burned alive. Galileo was forced to recant, not for being wrong, but for daring to touch the forbidden clock of the cosmos. When humanity loses the ability to place itself accurately in time, memory becomes fertile soil for myth. By controlling light from the heavens, the Vatican shaped how generations would see the darkness. It is often said that for nearly 1,000 years after Rome's fall, Europe was plunged into ignorance. People supposedly forgot how vast the world was, what lay across the seas, and how to craft accurate maps. But if that was true, where did maps exist that predate the Renaissance and depict lands unknown? The most striking example is the Piri Reis map, drawn in 1513. It shows the coastline of South America, the western edge of Africa, and even Antarctica, mapped as though it were free of ice. Piri Reis himself claimed his work came from ancient source maps whose origins remain unexplained. How could such accuracy exist centuries before modern? We are taught that after Rome's fall, Europe descended into a millennium of silence. Knowledge disappeared. Art faded. Science was forgotten. People supposedly lost the ability to build like their ancestors, lost their understanding of the stars, even forgot how to use ancient water systems. This is the picture engraved in our minds. A bewildered Europe, stumbling among ruins. But what if this image was carefully manufactured? Across the continent, fragments of evidence suggest otherwise. In Germany, bronze gears of exquisite craftsmanship have been unearthed, dated to this so-called age of ignorance. In abandoned monasteries, astronomers' tools of shocking precision have been found. Underground aqueducts and geothermal heating systems appear in remote villages untouched by Roman civilization. Who created them? Who understood their workings in an age, we are told, was dominated by superstition? Mainstream history calls such finds anomalies, archaeological oddities, and when something cannot be explained, it is quietly set aside. The Vatican, once again, remains silent. Let us not forget, across much of Europe, excavations in former church lands require approval from local authorities and tacit permission from the Vatican. Many artifacts removed for preservation are never seen again. A few independent archaeologists who have raised objections were sidelined, stripped of resources, or denied access to dig sites. In academic circles, they are branded as conspiracy theorists despite uncovering evidence that could shake the foundations of history. The greater question is this: did Europe truly forget everything, or was knowledge deliberately hidden to preserve the story of a dark and backward age? A Europe that inherited the brilliance of Rome would threaten any institution claiming to be the sole guardian of truth. If you control the story of ignorance, you control the light bringers. By holding silence, the Vatican does not need to lie. It only needs to let the narrative endure. Silence itself becomes power, and not all truths are destroyed. Some are kept, but delayed. The natural progress slowed, distorted, reshaped. History, then, is not just what happened, it is what has been allowed to be remembered. And it is within this delay that real power reveals itself. When we trace the arc of human civilization, an unsettling rhythm begins to appear. From ancient Rome through the Renaissance, the pace of invention seemed unnaturally frozen. Simple devices like the rotating shaft perfected by the Greeks vanished from use and did not return until the 13th century. The principles of mechanics, astronomy, and medicine once explored by Aristotle, Galen, and Archimedes disappeared, only to be rediscovered centuries later, as if they had never existed before. The true question is not why this knowledge vanished, but who ensured its delay and for what purpose. Once more, all paths lead back to the Vatican, the single institution that preserved ancient manuscripts, commanded Europe's monasteries, schools, and vast libraries. The knowledge of the world rested in its grip. And the point is not that it was destroyed, but that it was carefully rationed, released in measured doses across the centuries. When a religious authority governs not only souls, but also the stream of history, delay itself becomes a weapon. A society taught only to copy scripture without question will never invent. A generation told only of heaven and hell will not turn its eyes toward the stars or the workings of the body. 1,000 years without innovation may not mean ignorance, but rather guidance along a pre-written script. In such a world, time ceases to be an impartial flow and becomes an instrument of control. To manipulate the timeline is to command both the past and the future. The Vatican achieved this by dictating official history, fixing the dates of events, and deciding when knowledge was allowed to re-enter humanity's collective memory. They slowed awakening not with armies, but with delay. And when the world finally rediscovered what had once been known, the Church was already in place to present itself as the bringer of light, concealing that it had hidden that light all along. This was a subtle strategy, requiring no bloodshed, only the bending of time. Under this manipulation, entire civilizations moved more slowly, awaiting permission from the hand that held the clock. At the very heart of the Vatican, beneath immovable blocks of ancient stone where sunlight has never reached, lies a vault wrapped in legend and silence, the Vatican's secret archive, the Archivum Secretum Vaticanum. Its very name is enough to unsettle scholars, for it suggests that behind its locked doors lie the missing pieces of human history. And this is no myth. The archive exists, but no one in modern times has been granted full access. There are no public tours, no open catalogues, no comprehensive maps of its interior. Anyone hoping to study there, professor, historian, or researcher, must first endure a labyrinth of approvals, severe time limits, strict restrictions on material, and the absolute rule that no copy may ever leave. Within these walls, it is said, stretch more than 50 kilometers of shelving containing over 1 million documents dating from the 8th century onward. And what is known is merely the exposed tip of a vast iceberg. The unseen part remains concealed. No pope has explored every chamber. No cleric has openly spoken of its deepest contents. The very layout of the vault remains classified. Rumors whisper of manuscripts excluded from the Bible, records of heresy, tomes on forbidden sciences, private papal diaries, and most tantalizing of all, ancient maps showing the world in ways that overturn accepted history. What makes the archive unique is not simply the sheer volume of its collection, but the deliberate secrecy surrounding it. Centuries ago, the Vatican defined the Latin word secretum not as hidden, but as private, a clever linguistic shield. "We are not hiding," they claimed, "only keeping private." Yet, if what is kept private is the truth of human history itself, can it still be called an archive? No one knows exactly what is locked inside. But everyone knows this. If there exists a place capable of guarding the missing fragments of history, it is here. Not because of its physical depth, but because of the silence that surrounds it. When kings, scholars, and entire nations are denied entry, true power may not rest on a throne but upon a shelf. A shelf no one has been allowed to read. There are records that were never lost, never burned, never ruined by war, but hidden, carefully and deliberately. Accounts from the few scholars who gained fleeting access describe manuscripts that predate the Middle Ages, even the Church itself. These are not myths borrowed from distant lands, but knowledge born in Europe, buried beneath faith's cloak. Some are written in languages barely understood, Proto-Latin, heretical Greek. They contain precise astronomical observations, anatomical diagrams far ahead of their time, and philosophies that eclipse the rigid worldview the Church imposed. Why conceal them? Because they contradict the narrative. Proof that Europeans possessed advanced knowledge during the Dark Ages would collapse the idea that Christendom brought light to a fallen world. Wisdom existing outside of Scripture would strip the Church of its monopoly on truth. A manuscript describing non-Euclidean geometry centuries before its rediscovery. Another charting elliptical planetary motion long before Kepler. A medical handbook from Gaul written in Latin and Celtic, prescribing cures still beyond modern science. These things were not forgotten, they were hidden. And whenever fragments escape, whenever a page or passage appears, someone inevitably comes to claim it, always under the pretense of preservation or protection from distortion. Yet truth does not need to be protected in darkness. It needs only to be free. The Vatican, acting as both guardian and jailer, granted itself the right to decide which truths are revealed, which remain too dangerous. And dangerous here does not mean false, but too true, too soon. Perhaps these manuscripts survive perfectly intact in wooden shelves and stone chambers. Yet unread, unseen, and unshared, they may as well not exist. This is the most insidious destruction of all, knowledge preserved only to be silenced. Perhaps no text has been more controlled than the Bible itself. Beyond being a holy book, it has served as the legal, political, and social foundation of a spiritual empire stretching from Europe to South America. Yet few realize the Bible of today is not the original, but the product of centuries of edits, exclusions, and erasures. The Vatican has never denied this, only avoided explaining why certain writings were barred, or what would happen if they were unveiled. Scholars call them apocrypha. But apocrypha does not mean false. It means forbidden, excluded, not read aloud, not taught, not canonized. Among them, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Philip, the Book of Enoch, the Gospel of Judas. These writings reveal a different Jesus, not a distant, divine enigma, but a teacher urging inner awakening and self-reliance, guiding seekers to find truth within rather than through the Church. Were that accepted, what of the Church's role as intermediary between God and man? Some go further, describing human history before Adam, cycles of destruction and rebirth, and beings of light beyond the visible world. Such visions defy the doctrine the Vatican has protected for millennia. And so these texts were marked heretical, never printed, never preached, never discussed. For centuries, merely possessing one of those forbidden texts could mean execution, burning at the stake, or life behind bars. Many of these works were later uncovered in forgotten monasteries, quietly copied by monks who seemed to act as if they knew one day the truth would need to be spoken again. Some have been declassified and republished in modern times, Yet the Vatican still refuses to grant them doctrinal legitimacy. It remains silent, invoking sacred tradition. But if those writings were truly worthless, why hide them so carefully? Perhaps the real fear was never that people would simply accept the words, but that they would begin to ask questions. And every real awakening in history begins with a question that at first appears harmless. Not every war is fought with swords. Some campaigns are waged in whispers and archives, and their weapons are ideas. In the Middle Ages, especially in what we call the Dark Ages, anyone who challenged official doctrine or pursued forbidden knowledge risked being labeled a heretic. The punishment for that accusation was rarely mild. Giordano Bruno, philosopher and cosmologist, a Dominican friar by training, did not rebel for rebellion's sake. He could not reconcile a vision of creation with a single, earth-centered universe. He taught of countless worlds and of a God not confined to scriptural words. For such beliefs he was burned in Rome's Campo de' Fiori in 1600, his execution carried out amid prayers and the solemn silence of ecclesiastical courts. Bruno was only one among thousands. Monks who dared to translate ancient scrolls, physicians investigating old cures, astronomers, historians. Any soul who touched unapproved knowledge risked secret trials where accusation trumped evidence, and sentences ranged from imprisonment and torture to public immolation. The Inquisition, often spoken of as religious terror, functioned as an extraordinarily efficient engine for erasing dissent. It punished not merely people but the very ideas they held. Books that required decades to compose could be reduced to ash in minutes. The long silence that followed made later generations assume those works had never existed. In such a climate, silence equaled survival and curiosity equaled death. So complicity crept in and an entire continent drifted into a sleep of knowledge that lasted generations. Monastic life, imagined as peaceful transcription and prayer, masked a far more organized and far-reaching operation. A network that resembled an intelligence service in its mission to collect, control, and when convenient, erase books. As empires crumbled and libraries fell into ruin from the 8th century onward, the Church quietly set about salvaging every manuscript it could find before what it called heresy could claim them. This task did not fall to popes or princes, but to monastic orders, the Benedictines, planted in abbeys across Italy, France, England, and Germany, the Franciscans, rooted in local communities, the Dominicans, who later enforced orthodoxy, and the Jesuits, a formidable cadre of strategy and intellect loyal to Rome. They arrived not with arms, but with hospitality and empty satchels, borrowing ancient codices for safekeeping and often never returning them. Whole libraries that once housed thousands of volumes eventually held little more than the Bible and its commentaries. Anything that did not suit doctrine was either removed or rewritten to fit theological narratives. Yet the originals were rarely destroyed in a show of brute force. Burning was vulgar. The Vatican opted for a subtler refinement, secure possession. Texts were hidden where no one could read them, count them, or know how many there were. The Archivum Secretum, the Vatican's secret archive, became the resting place for countless manuscripts. Through these quiet, subterranean monastic circuits, the Church amassed not only spiritual authority, but the deep memory of civilization itself. For centuries, monks were archivists, censors, and erasers of history. There was no need to annihilate. Possession sufficed. There was no need for debate. Silence did the work. As antique knowledge was gathered into a single lamp holder, people came to believe the surrounding world was truly dark, simply because its light had been concentrated and guarded by those who decided when and where it would shine. Not everyone bowed. Some kept the light hidden with them rather than submit to erasure, and over time secret networks emerged to preserve fragments of forbidden truth. From roughly the 11th to the 14th centuries, traces of such groups begin to appear. Enigmatic symbols carved into churches, intricate motifs in crypts, architectural feats containing advanced knowledge. Among these currents were the Freemasons, originally master craftsmen who became a private community rich in codes and ritual, who built cathedrals while embedding symbols not strictly Christian: suns, moons, eyes, spirals, and proportional ratios. The Rosicrucians, a mystical strand claiming wisdom from Egypt and Babylon, passed knowledge in coded manuscripts and layered allegory. Alchemists, labeled sorcerers by clerics, pursued chemistry, astronomy, and practical science beyond sanctioned limits. These societies did not reject faith outright, but neither did they bow to its monopoly. They believed in an older, deeper stream of primordial knowledge that predated the institutions now claiming authority. Crucially, they suspected the Vatican had seized much of that inheritance and buried it in vaults and archives. Masonic symbols can be read as clandestine maps, a means of preserving core truths through imagery at a time when words could bring a stake. Geometry, the compass, the square, the letter G, all encoded practice and meaning for initiates. Because these secret custodians preserved fragments, the Vatican could not claim absolute control. The existence of parallel networks that hid and transmitted knowledge shows the Church's influence was formidable but not total. The battle for memory was not fought on a single front. It stretched across cloisters and crypts, workshops and lodges, papal libraries and tavern corners where forbidden ideas were whispered. History, therefore, was not simply erased or kept. It was contested, rationed, encoded, and occasionally rescued by those willing to risk everything to keep the light alive. History, however altered, always leaves behind its footprints. And often it is those who move silently on the edges who carry the last key, the one capable of opening the door out of the dark ages. When the flame of knowledge is seized and confined to a single place while the rest of the world is left in shadow, the outcome is inevitable. Some will find ways to preserve the light for themselves. Not all bent their heads. Not every scholar met the pyre. Some endured, not by surrendering the truth, but by concealing it. Over centuries, across countless generations, this resolve took shape in hidden circles, the secret societies. No record marks their precise beginning, yet between the 11th and 14th centuries, signs of them surfaced. Odd engravings on cathedral walls, cryptic carvings in tombs, architecture that carried wisdom centuries ahead of its time. The Freemasons stood out among them. First as builders of stone, later as architects of ideas, they became a closed brotherhood of rituals, codes, and hierarchy. They raised Europe's cathedrals, embellishing them with emblems not bound to Christianity: suns, moons, spirals, eyes, and perfect ratios. The Rosicrucians whispered of ancient wisdom, echoing Egypt and Babylon, their secrets preserved in layered allegories and manuscripts passed hand to hand. The alchemists, labeled sorcerers by the Church, were in reality seekers of chemistry, astronomy, and higher truths beyond the fences of doctrine. What united these groups was not rebellion against religion, but refusal to be ruled by it. They believed in a primeval river of knowledge deeper than any scripture, older than any institution, flowing long before Rome declared itself guardian of reality. And most telling, they suspected the Vatican had gathered much of that river into its vaults of stone. Masonic glyphs often served as veiled maps, transmitting truths through geometry and symbol when words could cost one's life. The compass, the square, the letter G, God, geometry, gnosis, all encoded fragments of the wisdom reserved for initiates. These societies never marched openly against Rome. In the shadows, they functioned as a counterweight. Their mission was not to topple faith, but to keep the spark alive. And that truth carries an unsettling implication. If secret societies preserved even fragments of knowledge, then the Vatican never held absolute dominion. History, however concealed, always leaves its residue. And again, it was those on the fringes who held the keys to break free of darkness. In every absolute system, the true prize is not gold or arms, but thought itself. To command thought, one does not need torture or chains, only emptiness. If people are given nothing to contemplate, they soon forget what questions to ask. When the story of the world is rationed and poured slowly from the pulpit, minds grow hollow. They cease questioning, not from prohibition, but from absence. In the so-called Dark Ages, a subtle machine of mental control grew into being, extinguishing awareness by starving it. Monks copied scripture again and again, but not Aristotle, not Archimedes, unless their lines could be bent to doctrine. Churches thundered about sin, salvation, and damnation, but never about the structure of society, the arc of history, or the power hidden in words. Generations rose under one vision alone. They were sinners, and only the Church held the key to redemption. Ignorance itself became sanctity. The unlearned were seen as holy, while the curious were marked as dangerous. Knowledge no longer symbolized virtue. It was recast as pride, even heresy. This was not ignorance by chance. It was cultivated, guarded, engineered. Literacy was outlawed for the masses in many lands. Only clergy could read. Even monks were shown only the fragments of scripture judged safe for them. Rome did not need to oppress every realm. It needed only to veil the world in fog. And if one lives in fog from birth to death, the fog itself seems like light. This was how mental dominion unfolded, not suddenly, but slowly, invisibly, without violence. It required no whips, only silence. It demanded no prisons, only the erasure of memory that there had once been another way of thinking. And here lies the true horror. When ignorance becomes ordinary, the knower is cast as the outcast. The cycle repeats endlessly. With the Vatican clutching the keys to memory and future alike, it need not speak. Its silence is enough. The world continues dreaming, mistaking convenience for truth, and thinking light can only be seen when permitted. And here lies the cruelest irony. Science is born of curiosity, of the hunger to know the cosmos, life, and self. Yet in the era of darkness, curiosity itself became the unpardonable sin. Not because inquiry was false, but because it was true. When Galileo raised a telescope and dared to say the Earth turned around the sun, he was not only describing astronomy, he was shattering the stage upon which man was cast as the universe's center. A stage Rome had cemented with faith, scripture, and authority. For this crime, he was dragged before the Inquisition and forced to swallow his own truth, not because it erred, but because it threatened the system. He escaped the flames, but spent his final years caged in his own home, punished not for rebellion, but for sight. Galileo was not the first. Roger Bacon in the 13th century was locked away for daring to test, to experiment, to peer into optics. Michael Servetus was burned alive for questioning dogma and exploring the circulation of blood. And behind them lie unnumbered scholars, erased, unremembered, vanished from the record simply because they thought differently. The battle was never about science itself. It was about the guardianship of truth. When Rome declared that truth must pass through doctrine, any knowledge outside that gate was forbidden to exist, regardless of its accuracy. The universities of the Middle Ages, most under church control, were not havens of free inquiry. They were foundries where minds were forged to think correctly, molded not to discover but to obey. Ancient scientific writings were locked away or shown only to carefully chosen scholars. Knowledge was placed inside a cage, and anything that reached beyond it was condemned as heresy. What grew more terrifying than censorship itself was the fear it bred. People stopped thinking, not because they lacked the ability, but because one stray idea could drag them to the stake. Science became a stranger in the very lands where it had once flourished. Centuries had to pass before the Renaissance and Enlightenment sparked humanity's escape from those invisible chains. But by then, how many years had been wasted? How many discoveries suffocated? How many truths were silenced before they could even be spoken? And the question that still lingers, how many truths remain hidden in vaults where no light has yet been permitted to shine? Picture a world where people could calculate the stars with precision, design structures beyond their time, and construct irrigation systems of astonishing complexity. And then imagine all of it vanishing, not through war or natural disaster, but because it did not serve the narrative of those in power. From the fall of Rome until the dawn of the Renaissance, Europe is said to have slept. No great machines, no towering inventions, no leaps of science. 1,000 years on pause. Yet elsewhere, humanity did not rest. China gave the world the compass, gunpowder, and the printing press. The Islamic Golden Age produced surgeons, advanced optics, and preserved nearly all Greek knowledge in Arabic. India made lasting strides in astronomy, medicine, and mathematics. Only Europe seemed silent. Not because minds stopped creating, but because creation was erased from the record. Thinkers, builders, inventors. They lived, they worked, but their marks were stripped away, replaced with tales of miracles. If a cathedral rose beyond the skills of its age, no one sought the engineer. Instead, they claimed a relic was touched by a saint, and the structure appeared as if by divine hand. If a device appeared, it was not the work of design, but a gift from heaven. Miracles filled the spaces where human knowledge was not permitted. But this narrative was not harmless. It erased belief in human potential, suffocated curiosity, and raised generations too frightened to ask, if not a miracle, then what? Who crafted these works? What knowledge did they hold? And why was it never passed forward? Within hidden archives and ancient maps, scholars still suspect the remains of these silenced periods lie waiting. Cryptic diagrams, notes of unknown origin, sketches far ahead of their supposed time. Yet once you label all progress as divine intervention, every question becomes blasphemy. And so, stone by stone, knowledge gave way to the fog of dogma. Names of the true creators disappeared, while the miracle alone was remembered. In that forgetting, power was secured. Chains were no longer needed when children were raised inside a prison disguised as a school. Control was achieved not with fire, but with memory. For centuries, education itself became the tool of authority. In medieval Europe, the Vatican ruled the schoolroom, dictating not only what was taught, but what was never to be known. From the first letters, a child was led to believe the earth stood at the center of the universe, that mankind was shaped in 6 days, and that all truth lived in one book. Should facts ever conflict with Scripture, the fault lay not with the text, but with the child. From the beginning, they were trained to believe before they could understand, to memorize before they could question. Critical thought was not simply discouraged, and it was treated as sin. In this system, faith towered above reason, and obedience stood as the highest virtue. What was withheld was as damaging as what was given. They were never taught about China's inventions, about Greek science, about the medical knowledge of the Islamic world, or India's mathematical brilliance. They were never shown that mankind could forge its own future. Instead, all wisdom was said to come only from God, delivered through the single gate of the church. This was no mistake, it was strategy. Raise a child inside a distorted version of history, and he will grow not only uninformed, but blind to the fact that he is uninformed. He will attend church, learn his letters, and believe this world is the only one that ever existed. Knowledge belonged only to the robed elite. Truth was not to be discovered, only received, and thus generations grew into obedient servants, not to faith itself, but to submission. The truth never needed to vanish completely. It only had to be replaced, simplified, softened, or turned into myth before young minds were strong enough to defend themselves. This is why so many chapters of history remain hazy today, not from lack of records, but from fear that if too many understood the past clearly, they would start asking the forbidden questions. And every time a generation learns to question, the walls of power begin to crack. Most imagine historical control through flames and executions, through silenced scholars and hidden manuscripts. But there is a subtler weapon, more lasting than fire: the textbook. By the 19th century, with industry rising, nations building schools, and nationalism swelling, Europe standardized education for millions. And with it, history became an instrument of politics. The very idea of the Dark Ages was not a medieval term, but a 19th century invention. Scholars and reformers recast 1,000 years as an age of ignorance and superstition, not to tell truth, but to glorify their present. By branding the centuries after Rome as a nightmare, they crowned themselves as the true bringers of light. Darkness was painted across the past so that the 19th century could shine brighter by comparison. Convenient, wasn't it? If you wish to highlight the brilliance of light, you must first stage the darkest night imaginable before it. But why did the Vatican remain silent while the Middle Ages, an era they once ruled, was portrayed in such bleak tones? Because they had no need to defend themselves. For centuries, through their grip on knowledge, they had already crafted a fractured legacy of history, one perfectly suited to being labelled as the Dark Ages. And once that label was imprinted onto textbooks, drilled into schools, and echoed across generations, it hardened into truth. The textbooks of the 19th century did not simply recount history. They cemented official memory. From Germany to England, France to Italy, children were taught a neat, linear story. Greece, Rome, Dark Ages, Renaissance, Enlightenment, modern world. A tidy sequence, simple to teach, easy to recall, but riddled with omissions. The forgotten strides in medicine, mathematics, and architecture during the Middle Ages. The crucial role of the Islamic world and the East in safeguarding and advancing knowledge. And most glaring of all, the Vatican's hand in controlling, censoring, and purging dissent, shaping the so-called darkness itself. Thus, in the classrooms of the 19th century, millions of children were raised to believe there had been an age when progress vanished, when superstition reigned supreme. No one asked who wrote this version of history. No professor pointed to the secret archives. No textbook questioned the centuries of vanished records. No one dared suggest that the Dark Ages might simply be a coat of black paint brushed onto the past to make the present look brighter. Notice how nearly every film set in medieval Europe is painted with the same brush. Grey skies, collapsing castles, muddy roads. Peasants in rags staring at the ground as if hope itself had been forgotten. Violence in every corner, superstition rampant. And always, somewhere in the backdrop, a looming church, its towering cross casting a shadow across the scene. This is no coincidence. Cinema, particularly since the 20th century, has become humanity's unofficial historian. And in the case of the so-called Dark Ages, it has not merely retold a version of the past, it has rewritten an entire era. Where 19th century textbooks created the framework of the Dark Ages, modern media transformed that framework into an emotional reality. People don't need to read a single manuscript to be convinced that medieval Europe was a black hole of ignorance. They've seen it on the screen. They've felt the despair. They believe it. And therein lies the danger. What grips us emotionally, we seldom question. From Hollywood's The Name of the Rose, Braveheart, Kingdom of Heaven, to endless television series about witches, inquisitions, and heretics, the same images are recycled endlessly. Ignorant peasants, torture chambers, oppressive churches. Almost never do we see Islamic learning centers. Almost never do we see advanced maps. Almost never do we see Eastern influence seeding European thought. Why? Because a narrative where the Vatican was the lone candle in a vast darkness is convenient. It is simple, it provides contrast, and most importantly, it supports what power has long wanted the public to believe. Once the image of the Dark Ages has been seared into our cultural memory through films, comics, games, and documentaries, any attempt to reclaim nuance feels like propaganda. Skeptics are branded radicals, doubters dismissed as eccentrics, Any evidence that contradicts the established imagery is reflexively rejected, yet reality tells a different story. During the so-called Dark Ages, there were advancements in agriculture, developments in mathematics, flourishing schools of thought within monasteries, and the birth of Romanesque and Gothic architecture. But such details rarely see the light of cinema, and the Vatican remains curiously protected, sometimes vilified, yes, but still preserved as the one guiding light amid a sea of ignorance. A contradiction, yet a useful one. So when a child grows up learning from standardized textbooks while absorbing hundreds of hours of media built on the same premise, history stops being a living question. It becomes a fixed painting. A painting not drawn by those who lived the time, but by directors, screenwriters, and those who funded them. In such a world, truth doesn't die in shadow. It perishes beneath the spotlight. When any institution claims to be the custodian of truth, the first question humanity is entitled to ask is this: then show us everything you know. But with the Vatican, that has never been granted. For centuries, the Church has confiscated, censored, and locked away thousands of works, ancient manuscripts, scientific treatises, religious texts, historical records, writings from other traditions. Many were consigned to the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the Index of Forbidden Books, which existed from 1559 until 1966. Though eventually abolished, its legacy endures. The books themselves remain absent. Why? If those texts are false, let scholars dissect them. If they are harmless, why keep them sealed? If they simply offer alternative perspectives, wouldn't an enlightened world celebrate that diversity? But the Vatican has chosen silence. At the heart of Vatican City lies the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum, the Vatican Secret Archive. While the word secretum once meant private, in practice it means sealed. Access is tightly controlled. Only select scholars may enter, and even then requests are limited to specific documents, one at a time. No photography, no free copying. And material that conflicts with doctrine is buried deepest, where only a chosen few may tread. What lies hidden? Some claim the archives hold records of forgotten periods of human brilliance, erased from the official timeline. Others suspect proof of the influence of pagan, Islamic, and Eastern philosophies on early Christianity. Perhaps even documents showing that many so-called revelations were, in truth, editorial choices. The refusal to release these works is no accident. It is not neglect, it is strategy. For once those texts see the light of day, the entire scaffolding of history will demand rewriting not only the Dark Ages, but the Vatican's central role in constructing those shadows in the first place. We may never know all that is sealed away, but silence sustained over centuries is itself a message. Something must remain hidden. In the digital age, no one needs to burn books. If they are locked in vaults, inaccessible to all, they may as well have never existed. And so, in the absence of truth, the official story marches on. It lives in classrooms. It thrives on screens. It echoes through the corridors of St. Peter's Basilica, where the light shines so bright that no one bothers to ask about the darkness beneath. Modern history loves a neat story. Rome falls. Humanity stumbles into 1,000 years of night. Then the Renaissance bursts forth like dawn. Leonardo's sketching flight. Copernicus recentering the heavens. Michelangelo chiseling human divinity into stone. It reads like a fairy tale. But step back and ask, where did that sudden brilliance truly come from? And why did a continent supposedly quiet for a millennium suddenly produce geniuses who seemed to pull whole arts and sciences from thin air? The easy answer, they rediscovered the ancients, doesn't satisfy. Why would knowledge vanish for 1,000 years only to be accidentally recovered? How did individuals living in socially stunted societies reach such dizzying heights almost overnight? And who safeguarded those sources so perfectly that they resurfaced exactly when they were most useful? The trail once more points to the Church. For centuries, monastic libraries, Benedictine scriptoria, later Jesuit collections, had quietly gathered, copied, and stored countless manuscripts, not to publish, but to preserve. Then, in the 15th and 16th centuries, as papal authority faced scandals and challenge, portions of this hoard were released in measured doses, presented to the public as rediscoveries, and thus a rebirth was recorded. Humanity did not so much advance as return, allowed back into a room from which it had been barred. The masterpieces of the Renaissance were less spontaneous eruptions of mass genius than carefully timed releases of knowledge. Artists, anatomists, astronomers often worked hand in glove with clergy or with texts that had been sealed in clerical hands. Breakthroughs arrived as curated waves, not as an organic flood. If the Renaissance restored knowledge that had already existed, then the neat timeline we accept deserves re-examination. Perhaps knowledge was never truly lost, only concealed until those who held it chose the moment to let it shine. Light need not blaze to be powerful. Sometimes a lamp hidden in darkness, revealed at will, seems miraculous. We are raised on smooth, linear history: Rome, darkness, Renaissance, Enlightenment, modernity. Each era labeled, dated, and narrated by credentialed scholars until the sequence feels inevitable. But real history is untidy, riddled with contradictions, gaps, and fragments that refuse to fit a tidy palette. Dig deep and you find anomalies, repeated events, duplicated figures with different names, timelines that jump without reason. These are not fringe fantasies, but genuine scholarly puzzles now being revisited. If history has been edited not merely to record but to direct, the question is not whether we are deceived, but how much of the original story we have already lost. When collective memory is rewritten for long enough, the revised story becomes the only reality people know, a reality in which the past is not discovered but delivered to each generation ready-made. Those who ask why and how are the necessary irritants of every civilization, the ones who pry open the consensus and let fresh air in, but paradoxically, the more precisely they question, the more likely they are to be pushed aside. Look at the record of researchers who challenged orthodox chronologies, linguists, archaeologists, astronomers, even clergymen who raised inconvenient facts. Their fates resemble one another: marginalization, funding cuts, sudden resignations, mysterious disappearances, or deaths at moments when revelation seemed imminent. It is rarely the church acting bluntly. Instead, a whole ecosystem, universities, foundations, publishers, media, often trained over centuries to favor the orthodox, stands ready to quiet inconvenient voices. Studies that expose calendar anomalies, illogical maps, or suspiciously repetitive dynastic patterns seldom survive the peer review gauntlet, not because the ideas are automatically false, but because they unsettle the tightly woven narrative that supports institutional authority. Independent scholars who suggest the Dark Ages may be a painted-over era of achievement often vanish from mainstream discourse, not for lack of evidence, but because touching the forbidden triggers institutional reflexes. Why is this? Because only one force in history has ever had the means to control knowledge, sacred authority, and the framing of time itself: the Church. When monasteries were the sole centers permitted to copy manuscripts, when the liturgical calendar regulated how dates were recorded, and when dissenting ideas were branded with heresy, history stopped being an impartial record and became an instrument. The custodians of books became the custodians of memory. The pulpit became the place where the past was authorized. If stretches of the timeline were manufactured or grafted to suit political or doctrinal ends, once printed and taught for generations, they attain the weight of truth. And that is the most durable form of power, not the sword, but the sanctioned story. This is not idle paranoia. Serious scholars have catalogued oddities, suspiciously duplicated reigns, chronological gaps, and calendrical shifts tied to political reforms like the adoption of Julian and later Gregorian systems. Some researchers argue whole blocks of years were effectively inserted. Others say names were recycled to fill blanks. The response from mainstream institutions is predictable and swift: skepticism, professional isolation, and the evaporation of support. It's as if an unwritten rule polices the perimeter of acceptable questions. Touch the right thread and the fabric tightens. The more you pull, the tougher it resists. So where does this leave us? If history can be curated, staged, and mass-produced, the duty of those who value truth is to look deeper, to follow oddities rather than smooth narratives, to preserve uncomfortable inquiries rather than smother them, and to remember that certainty often masks constructed consensus. The past should not be a cloak for power. It should be the place where questions are born. If those questions have been denied their day, then the work of rediscovery becomes not merely academic, but an act of reclaiming what it means to know ourselves. And that fear spreads like an unseen sickness. Those who remain, who know too well what happens to anyone who crosses the line, quickly learn to stay quiet. They learn to lower their gaze, to write only within the safe margins, until one day censorship is no longer necessary because no one dares to step outside of it. For more than 1,000 years, the Vatican has stood at the heart of Europe, an untouchable monument of power where even world leaders still bow, a religious empire whose reach extends beyond borders, regimes, and centuries. But the closer you draw to that brilliance, the more you feel that something is hidden, not in darkness, but in a blinding light. On the surface, the Vatican presents itself as a shepherd of faith, a beacon of compassion, a guardian of eternal values. Yet behind that facade lies the largest archive on earth, millions of documents sealed from public view. It has burned countless manuscripts and books condemned as heretical. It dictated the flow of history by reshaping calendars. It crafted the illusion of the so-called Dark Ages while keeping itself the only source of permitted knowledge. It ignored archaeological, astronomical, and cultural evidence that contradicted doctrine, all while guarding its power through control of memory itself. And this forces us to ask, is that the work of a spiritual leader or the gatekeeper of knowledge? Perhaps at one time they convinced themselves it was necessary. Perhaps they believed humanity was not ready for the whole truth. That social order required stability rather than chaos born from competing narratives. That faith was more vital than facts. But faith without freedom is fragile. And knowledge hidden is knowledge destroyed. If the Vatican truly bears the light, that light should not be buried beneath stone vaults. If they are keepers of truth, truth should be revealed, not censored. If what they hold can rewrite our story, then silence is not protection, it is betrayal. No one denies the Vatican's spiritual influence. But no one should deny this either. When an institution hoards knowledge, it is no longer simply guiding. It is deciding. It is choosing who may know the past, and in doing so shaping the future. Because when the past is sealed, the future becomes nothing more than a polished illusion. History is often compared to a river. But what if that river was redirected long ago and we never realized? One of the most debated theories today, gaining traction in independent circles, is the phantom time hypothesis. This theory claims that nearly 300 years of medieval European history were fabricated. That almost 3 centuries, the so-called Dark Ages, never happened at all. And if so, the current year is not 2025 but closer to 1725. Impossible? Let's examine. First, there is remarkably little archaeological evidence for the years between 600 and 900. Artifacts, writings, verified records. Most of what we know comes from church documents, written or rewritten under its authority. Second, astronomical records, eclipses, comets, planetary alignments, fail to match medieval timelines. Modern simulations often show discrepancies of centuries. Third, certain rulers and figures seem eerily duplicated, appearing across dynasties under different names, yet with nearly identical roles, personalities, and stories. Coincidence or an attempt to fill in manufactured time? And finally, the ultimate question, who would benefit from inventing nearly 300 years? The answer points once more to the Vatican. By adding phantom centuries, the Church not only gave itself the illusion of unbroken antiquity, but also created distance between Rome's fall and the modern age. If people believed they had endured a millennium of darkness, they would be less likely to question the official story. Consider, too, the calendars. Some civilizations counted years from creation, others by Byzantine reckoning. Later, the Gregorian reform corrected time, but in doing so, deepened the chaos of chronology. So how certain can we be that the date we call 2025 is truly accurate? If truth were revealed, the number might shrink by centuries, not in our progress, but in the very timeline itself. Now imagine, we live in an age of AI, of space exploration, of advanced science, yet the very clock we live by may rest on false foundations. If time is the framework of history and time itself is wrong, then our entire human story collapses. No one can claim certainty, but the questions multiply. And what becomes clearer is this: we may not truly know where we are because we may never have truly known where we came from. We are born into a world of names, dates, stories already written. We open our eyes in the year 2025 and accept it, surrounded by tales of empires, kings, and revolutions, because no one wants to begin life by asking, what if all this is false? But within that smooth, polished flow of history, cracks appear, gaps, contradictions, moments where nothing quite adds up. And when you touch one of those cracks, history opens like a heavy door, just enough for you to glimpse a name erased, a story buried. We speak proudly of progress, but if the beginning of the story was altered, hidden, or even invented, then how can we measure how far we have come? We may not be living on the true day of history at all. We may simply be repeating an old script, believing it new. And when the true past is erased, we lose more than memory. We lose the power to shape what comes next. For there is only one danger greater than forgetting by design. History does not demand belief. It demands questions. And if this journey has planted even one doubt, then you have already stepped closer to a truth long hidden. If you believe this search should continue, subscribe, not just to follow, but to keep alive the questions others fear to ask. Because sometimes one well-placed question is enough to shake the foundations of a carefully guarded past.